No one could explain why the police dog was barking at a house that wasn't burning. 3 minutes later, the entire block would understand. The first siren cut through the cool mountain air just before dawn, its mournful cry echoing across the quiet streets of Pine Hollow, Colorado, where white picket fences, old maple trees, and rows of modest homes still slept beneath a fading blanket of stars. A dry wind drifted down from the hills carrying the faint scent of pine, dust, and something else that made Officer Ethan Walker lift his head before the radio even crackled. It was the smell of smoke, distant but growing stronger with every breath. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose sable coat shimmered beneath the flashing red and blue lights. His ears stood rigid, his amber eyes fixed somewhere beyond the rooftops, and unlike every other emergency call they had answered together, he wasn't watching Ethan for direction. He was already searching. Dispatch reported a wildfire moving faster than expected after powerful overnight winds pushed flames across the eastern ridge. Evacuation crews were heading toward the neighborhoods closest to the forest, while firefighters raced to establish containment lines before sunrise. Ethan tightened the strap of his protective vest and rested one steady hand against Ranger's shoulder. They had trained together for nearly 5 years, long enough for Ethan to recognize the difference between ordinary alertness and the quiet certainty that settled over the dog now. Ranger's breathing slowed. His nose lifted into the wind. Then he stepped forward without waiting for a command. The rescue convoy rolled through narrow streets as porch lights flickered awake one by one. Families hurried outside carrying blankets, pets, treasured photographs, and sleepy children wrapped in oversized jackets. Fire engines rumbled past, their lights reflecting across windows already clouded by drifting smoke. Ash floated through the air like gray snow, settling on sidewalks and parked trucks while the horizon glowed with a deep orange light that seemed far too bright for that hour of the morning. Ethan scanned each home as volunteers moved door to door, calling names and guiding neighbors toward waiting buses. Everything followed the practiced rhythm of emergency response until Ranger suddenly stopped in front of a small blue farmhouse near the edge of Willow Street. The yard was calm. No flames touched the roof. No smoke escaped the windows. Even the curtains hung perfectly still behind the glass. Yet Ranger planted his paws firmly against the pavement and unleashed a bark so sharp that every conversation nearby fell silent. Ethan frowned. "Easy, buddy." Ranger ignored him. He barked again, louder this time, then pulled hard toward the front porch with a determination Ethan had only witnessed during life-or-death searches. One firefighter glanced over and shook his head. Wrong house. Fire still half a mile away. Ethan wanted to believe him. Everything he could see supported that conclusion. But experience had taught him something impossible to measure. Ranger had never wasted urgency. Not once. The German shepherd paced in tight circles before stopping again, staring past the quiet house toward the row of homes stretching beyond it, his body tense, his gaze fixed on something hidden behind walls no human eyes could yet see. Then, somewhere beyond the stillness of Willow Street, a deep rumble rolled beneath the earth, and every instinct Ethan possessed told him this morning was about to become something no one in Pine Hollow would ever forget. The rumble grew louder, low and steady, like distant thunder rolling beneath the streets instead of across the sky. Ethan turned toward the eastern ridge where a thick wall of smoke climbed higher with every passing second, swallowing the first pale colors of sunrise. The orange glow behind the trees had become brighter, no longer a distant warning, but a living force carried forward by relentless wind. Emergency vehicles continued moving through Pine Hollow in carefully coordinated lines, while volunteers guided families toward the community center nearly 2 miles west of town. Children clutched stuffed animals beneath heavy blankets. Elderly couples leaned on neighbors for support, and anxious voices blended with the endless chorus of engines, radios, and barking dogs unsettled by the strange morning. Yet amid all the movement, Ranger refused to leave the quiet blue farmhouse. His ears remained fixed forward, his nose working the smoky air with astonishing focus. Ethan knelt beside him and rested a hand against the dog's neck. Ranger's muscles felt tight beneath his thick coat, not with fear, but with determination. He trusted those instincts more than any map or weather report. A firefighter named Michael Donovan jogged toward them, his yellow helmet streaked with ash. He was 39, broad-shouldered, and carried the calm confidence that came from nearly 2 decades of battling wildfires across the Rockies. "Officer, we have confirmation the fire is still east of Cedar Ridge. This block should have another 20 minutes before evacuation becomes urgent." Ethan nodded slowly but kept watching Ranger. "Then tell me why he thinks we are already too late." Michael glanced toward the silent house before looking back at the German Shepherd. "Maybe he smells frightened pets inside." It was a reasonable explanation, but Ranger suddenly turned away from the porch and sprinted toward the back alley without warning. Ethan rose immediately and followed, calling his partner's name. The narrow gravel lane behind the houses was empty except for scattered trash cans, wooden fences, and drifting ribbons of smoke carried between backyards by unpredictable gusts. Ranger moved quickly, stopping every few yards to sniff the ground before surging ahead again. He ignored every distraction, every unfamiliar scent, as though following a single invisible trail that only he could recognize. Ethan noticed something unusual as they reached the rear of the neighborhood. The smoke smelled different here. Not simply burning pine or dry brush, but something sharper, heavier, almost metallic. Ranger stopped beside an aging utility shed near a fenced maintenance lot. He lowered his head and released a deep growl unlike any Ethan had heard that morning. The officer scanned the area until his eyes settled on a narrow service road disappearing toward a cluster of aging propane storage tanks that supplied several nearby homes during the winter months. One maintenance gate stood partially open, swinging gently in the strengthening wind. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. The wildfire itself had not reached this side of town, but flying embers certainly could. If even one burning branch landed where dry grass surrounded those tanks, the danger would spread far beyond a single street. Ethan reached for his radio. Before he could speak, a maintenance worker came running around the corner, his face pale beneath a layer of soot. He struggled to catch his breath before pointing toward the storage yard. "Officer," he gasped, "one of the safety valves is venting, and we cannot get close enough to secure it before the fire reaches the hill." Ranger barked once, loud enough to silence everyone nearby. This time, no one questioned why. The words settled over the gathering like the falling ash that drifted across the service road. Ethan looked beyond the chain-link fence where rows of silver propane tanks stood beneath a haze of thickening smoke, each one surrounded by patches of dry summer grass that swayed under powerful gusts blowing straight from the eastern ridge. The wildfire was still hidden behind the forested hills, but the wind had become its advance messenger, carrying heat, smoke, and glowing embers farther than anyone had predicted before sunrise. Fire Captain Michael Donovan immediately radioed the command post, requesting an updated fire projection while utility crews hurried toward the storage yard with emergency shutoff equipment. The answer that came back over the radio chilled every experienced responder standing nearby. Winds had increased to nearly 40 miles per hour, and the fire line was advancing almost twice as fast as earlier forecasts suggested. They had less than 15 minutes before flames reached the first line of pine trees overlooking the maintenance yard. Ethan glanced at Ranger, who had not taken his eyes off the fenced compound. The German Shepherd suddenly lowered his head and began moving along the perimeter, sniffing each section of fencing with remarkable precision. He ignored the nearest gate and continued another 50 yards until he stopped beside a narrow gravel path almost hidden behind thick juniper bushes. Ranger barked once before looking back at Ethan with the same unwavering expression that had saved lives more than once during search operations. Ethan followed without hesitation. The path curved behind an abandoned maintenance garage where stacks of weathered lumber and rusted equipment had remained untouched for years. Smoke drifted through the trees in slow gray ribbons, reducing visibility with every passing minute. As they rounded the building, Ethan noticed something the others could not see from the main entrance. A small utility truck sat parked beside an electrical shed with both driver's side doors standing wide open. The engine was silent, but fresh tire tracks marked the dusty ground. Someone had been there only moments earlier. Ranger trotted toward the truck, sniffed the driver's seat, then turned sharply and ran deeper into the maintenance corridor between storage buildings. Ethan called after him, but the dog never slowed. He trusted that urgency. He always had. Around the next corner, Ranger stopped beside a narrow concrete drainage channel partially hidden beneath overgrown weeds. At first, Ethan heard nothing except the steady whistle of the wind. Then a faint sound reached him. Someone was calling for help. It was weak, interrupted by coughing, but unmistakably human. Ethan hurried down the embankment and discovered an elderly maintenance worker sitting against the concrete wall with an injured ankle after apparently slipping while attempting to inspect the emergency valves. His gray work shirt was stained with dirt. His breathing labored from the heavy smoke. Yet relief filled his tired blue eyes the moment he saw the German Shepherd. "I tried to close the secondary valve," the man whispered between breaths. The warning alarm never reached the control office. Ethan immediately radioed for medical assistance while offering the man water from his emergency pack. Before the conversation could continue, the maintenance worker gripped Ethan's sleeve with surprising strength. "Officer," he said quietly, struggling to steady his voice, "there is another problem. The daycare bus never made it out of Willow Street." The driver turned around because of the smoke. "There were 8 children still inside when I last saw them heading toward the church parking lot." Ethan's heart skipped. That location lay directly between the approaching wildfire and the propane storage yard. Ranger lifted his head toward the growing wall of smoke, ears standing tall once again. Without waiting for another command, he spun toward the western road and sprinted into the haze, already chasing the next life that needed to be found. The church bell rang once through the smoke before falling silent again, its lonely echo swallowed by the growing roar of the wildfire climbing over the eastern ridge. Ethan chased after Ranger, his boots striking cracked pavement coated in drifting ash while emergency vehicles raced toward opposite ends of Pine Hollow. The air had changed. Every breath felt warmer, heavier, carrying the bitter scent of burning pine mixed with melting asphalt and damp earth. Above the rooftops, thousands of glowing embers floated across the morning sky like restless fireflies searching for a place to land. Ranger ran with absolute certainty, weaving through empty intersections and abandoned bicycles left where frightened children had dropped them during the evacuation. Porch swings creaked in the strengthening wind, flags snapped violently from their poles, and garden wind chimes sang strange hollow notes that seemed almost like whispered warnings. Ethan caught sight of the old brick church standing near the center of Willow Street, its white steeple barely visible behind thick smoke rolling through the neighborhood. Several evacuation buses had already departed, but the parking lot stood nearly empty except for one small yellow daycare bus resting beside the front entrance with its engine off. Relief washed over Ethan for only a heartbeat before he noticed the driver standing outside waving both arms desperately. "The children are not here," she shouted as Ethan approached. "We had to leave the bus because smoke filled the road. Sister Margaret brought everyone inside while I tried to find another exit, but the side doors will not open now." Ethan looked toward the church. The heavy wooden entrance remained closed, and smoke curled around the stained glass windows facing the street. Captain Michael Donovan arrived moments later with 2 firefighters carrying breathing equipment, but one glance toward the advancing flames told them the situation was changing faster than expected. Burning branches had begun falling into nearby yards, and every gust scattered fresh embers across dry grass surrounding the church grounds. "We have minutes," Michael said quietly. "No more than that." Ethan nodded, already reaching for the front doors. Before anyone could force them open, Ranger darted away again. Instead of circling the entrance, he disappeared along the side of the building, slipping between hedges that bordered an old stone prayer garden. Ethan followed, trusting the German Shepherd without hesitation. Behind the church, hidden beneath climbing ivy and decades of weathered brick, Ranger stopped beside a narrow wooden gate that hung crooked on rusted hinges. Beyond it stretched a small service courtyard leading toward the church kitchen. The dog pressed his nose against the bottom of a weathered cellar door almost invisible beneath creeping vines. Then he barked once, sharp and confident. Ethan rushed forward and grabbed the iron handle. At first it refused to move. Years of moisture had swollen the old wood tight against its frame. Michael joined him, and together they pulled with steady determination until the door finally gave way with a deep groan. Cool air drifted upward from the dim basement, carrying the unmistakable sound of frightened children. Tiny voices answered Ethan's call almost immediately. Sister Margaret appeared first, her silver hair tucked beneath a simple gray veil as she guided 8 children toward the stone staircase with remarkable calm despite the smoke creeping through narrow basement windows. The youngest child held a small stuffed rabbit so tightly that its faded ears trembled with every step. Ranger remained at the bottom of the stairs instead of climbing out with the others. His ears suddenly lifted again. His nose turned toward the far end of the dark basement where old storage rooms disappeared into shadow. A soft sound echoed through the silence. It was not one of the children. Someone else was still inside. The faint sound came again, barely louder than a whisper beneath the growing chorus of creaking beams and distant sirens. Ranger did not hesitate. He moved deeper into the basement with slow, deliberate steps, his nose sweeping across the cool concrete floor while Ethan followed with his flashlight cutting narrow paths through the dusty darkness. Behind them, Captain Michael Donovan and the firefighters guided Sister Margaret and the 8 children safely toward the courtyard where paramedics waited with blankets and oxygen masks. Ethan glanced over his shoulder long enough to see every child emerge into the smoky morning before turning back toward Ranger. The German Shepherd had stopped outside an old storage room tucked beneath the church sanctuary. The heavy wooden door stood slightly open, blocked by a fallen bookshelf that had shifted during the morning's violent winds. From inside came a weak cough, followed by the soft cry of a frightened child. Ethan immediately dropped to one knee and squeezed through the narrow opening. His flashlight revealed shelves lined with canned food, folding chairs, and boxes of holiday decorations coated with years of dust. In the far corner, curled beside a large wooden cabinet, sat a little girl no older than 6. She hugged a small orange tabby cat tightly against her chest, tears streaking through the soot on her cheeks. The frightened animal trembled but refused to leave her arms. "It is all right," Ethan said gently, lowering his voice until it became almost as calm as the steady breathing beside him. "My name is Ethan, and this is Ranger. We came to bring you home." The little girl looked toward the German Shepherd with wide blue eyes. Instead of crying, she whispered, "I could not leave Pumpkin. He was hiding, and everyone ran upstairs." Ranger slowly walked forward and lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the kitten. The cat sniffed him for a brief moment before settling quietly, as though recognizing something safe in the great dog's calm presence. Ethan smiled softly despite the urgency pressing against every second. He carefully lifted the little girl while she continued holding her kitten close beneath her jacket. Ranger turned immediately toward the exit, but halfway across the basement, he stopped once again. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. The German Shepherd stared toward another hallway leading beneath the oldest section of the church, where thick stone walls disappeared into darkness. A maintenance map hanging near the staircase suddenly caught Ethan's attention. The basement connected through an old utility corridor to the neighboring community shelter, a building already being used as an evacuation center. If the church entrance became blocked by smoke or falling debris, dozens of people gathering next door might never realize another escape route existed. Ethan radioed Captain Donovan and quickly explained what he had found. Within moments, firefighters redirected volunteers through the underground passage, opening a second evacuation path that allowed elderly residents and families with young children to move safely away from the increasingly dangerous streets above. As the final group disappeared into the shelter, Michael looked back toward Ethan with disbelief. "If Ranger had not found this corridor," he said quietly, "we would never have known it existed." Ethan reached down and gently rested his hand against Ranger's neck. The German Shepherd looked toward the ceiling where faint vibrations rolled through the stone overhead. The wildfire was closer now. The warm glow filtering through tiny basement windows had changed from pale orange to a fierce crimson that painted every wall with restless light. Then the emergency radio on Ethan's shoulder crackled with a new transmission. A firefighter station near the propane storage yard spoke only one sentence before static swallowed the rest. "The fire has reached the eastern fence." Ranger lifted his head instantly. Without waiting for another command, he was already running toward the daylight once more. The sky above Pine Hollow had disappeared behind a ceiling of smoke so thick that morning looked more like late evening. Every gust of wind carried glowing embers across empty streets where abandoned bicycles, lawn chairs, and garden hoses stood frozen in place as though the town itself had paused to hold its breath. Ethan and Ranger emerged from the church courtyard at a run, joining Captain Michael Donovan and the advancing rescue crews as emergency radios filled the air with overlapping reports. Firefighters were holding the eastern perimeter, utility workers were attempting to isolate the propane supply, and evacuation teams were clearing the final homes nearest Cedar Ridge. Then another transmission broke through the static. A volunteer search team had reached the neighborhood overlooking the storage yard, but one elderly couple refused to leave because they believed their grandson was still somewhere inside the family woodworking shop behind their home. Ethan looked toward the rising wall of smoke beyond the church steeple. That workshop stood directly along the narrow road leading toward the propane tanks. Every minute mattered now. Ranger surged forward before anyone issued another assignment, his powerful stride carrying him through swirling ash while Ethan followed close behind. They reached the property to find the elderly couple waiting anxiously at the front gate, their faces lined with exhaustion and fear. The grandfather pointed toward the detached workshop tucked behind tall pine trees. "Oliver was helping me stack lumber," he said, struggling to steady his voice. "When the smoke rolled in, I lost sight of him." Ethan assured them that help had arrived before moving toward the building with Ranger leading the way. The workshop door stood open, gently rocking in the wind. Inside, the scent of fresh cedar mixed with smoke drifting through the rafters where thin beams of reddish light filtered between weathered boards. Ranger slowed, nose close to the wooden floor, weaving carefully between workbenches, shelves of neatly arranged tools, and stacks of unfinished furniture. Ethan listened carefully. At first, there was only the distant howl of the wind. Then came a soft tapping sound from the far side of the shop. Ranger immediately changed direction and stopped beside a large cabinet that had tipped sideways, blocking access to a narrow storage alcove. Ethan called out, and a young voice answered from behind the cabinet. "I am here." Relief swept across the room. Ethan and another firefighter worked together to shift the heavy cabinet just enough to create a safe opening. A small boy of about 9 crawled out holding a wooden birdhouse tightly against his chest. His eyes were red from the smoke, but he managed a nervous smile when Ranger gently nudged his hand with a warm nose. "I made this for Grandma," Oliver whispered. Ethan smiled back. "She is waiting for you." As they stepped outside, the reunited family embraced one another with quiet gratitude before paramedics escorted them toward the evacuation buses. Ethan turned toward the eastern ridge just as Captain Donovan received another urgent update. Despite every effort, burning trees had crossed the final containment line near the propane storage yard. Utility crews had managed to reduce the pressure inside several tanks, but one remote emergency shutoff station remained unreachable because fallen trees blocked the service road. If that valve could not be secured before the advancing fire arrived, the evacuation zone would have to expand across nearly the entire western half of Pine Hollow. Ethan looked at the map displayed on the command vehicle, searching for another route, but it was Ranger who found the answer first. The German Shepherd stood perfectly still before turning toward an old hiking trail, disappearing into the forest behind the workshop, a forgotten path once used by park rangers decades earlier. His ears lifted, his amber eyes fixed on the trees, and without hesitation he began running toward the hidden trail that no one else seemed to remember. The forgotten trail disappeared beneath towering ponderosa pines whose branches swayed against a sky darkened by rolling smoke. Few people in Pine Hollow even remembered the old ranger path. Years earlier, it had served as a maintenance route for forest crews before a newer access road replaced it, leaving the narrow trail hidden beneath fallen needles, moss, and wild grass. Ranger never slowed. His powerful stride remained steady as he threaded between weathered boulders and leaning aspens with the confidence of a guide who somehow understood exactly where every turn would lead. Ethan stayed close behind, followed by Captain Michael Donovan and 2 utility specialists carrying emergency equipment. The farther they climbed, the warmer the air became. Ash drifted through shafts of dim orange light, settling across Ranger's sable coat until he appeared dusted and gray. The smell of burning pine grew stronger with every step, but beneath it Ethan caught another familiar scent, the sharp metallic odor of propane riding the wind. Ranger abruptly veered downhill through a stand of young cedar trees before stopping beside a rusted chain-link fence almost completely hidden by thick brush. Beyond it stood the remote emergency shutoff station, a compact concrete structure connected to underground pipelines feeding the storage yard below. The forgotten trail had led them directly to the one place no fire engine could reach in time. One utility worker stared in disbelief. "I have worked here for 12 years, he said quietly. "I forgot this access point even existed." They hurried inside the weathered enclosure where gauges flickered beneath layers of dust and dried leaves. One pressure indicator climbed higher than expected while warning lights flashed across an aging control panel. The senior technician immediately began the shutdown sequence, carefully turning heavy steel valves while another inspected the backup safety system. Ethan remained outside with Ranger, watching the tree line where smoke rolled steadily closer. The wind shifted again. This time, glowing embers floated across the hillside, landing harmlessly against damp rocks, but reminding everyone how little time remained. Minutes felt impossibly small against a fire that never stopped moving. Suddenly, Ranger stiffened. His ears lifted toward the forest above the station. He released one short bark before running uphill into thicker smoke. Ethan called after him, but the German shepherd disappeared between the trees. Without hesitation, Ethan followed. The hillside grew steeper until exposed roots crossed the trail like weathered ropes. Visibility shrank to only a few yards as smoke drifted low across the ground. Ranger's bark echoed again, louder this time. Ethan reached a small clearing where an old observation platform overlooked the valley. There, huddled beside the wooden railing, sat a park volunteer in his late 60s wrapped in a faded green jacket. A portable weather station lay beside him, its antenna bent after being knocked over by strong winds. The man looked exhausted but conscious. "I stayed to send wind reports," he said with a weak smile. "When the smoke came down, I lost the trail." Ethan helped him carefully to his feet, while Ranger stood quietly at the volunteer's side, offering steady reassurance with every gentle nudge of his shoulder. Together, they guided him back toward the shutoff station just as the utility crew completed the final emergency valve rotation. A long mechanical groan echoed beneath the hillside. Moments later, the pressure gauges began falling, one steady mark at a time. The technicians exchanged relieved glances. The system was stabilizing. Far below, firefighters radioed confirmation that the storage yard pressure had dropped across every monitored line. Captain Donovan exhaled deeply before looking toward Ethan. "That old trail just changed everything," he said. Yet Ranger was not celebrating. The German shepherd remained fixed on the valley below, where Pine Hollow rested beneath a blanket of drifting smoke. His amber eyes followed something moving through the haze. Ethan raised his binoculars and focused toward the western edge of town. Through the shifting smoke, he spotted a small white pickup stopped beside the river bridge, isolated from the evacuation convoy by fallen trees. It was too far away to identify the driver, but one thing was immediately clear. Someone was still stranded, and the only safe road leading there was disappearing beneath smoke with every passing minute. The white pickup remained motionless beside the old river bridge while smoke drifted across the water in slow gray waves, hiding and revealing the truck with every passing gust. Ethan lowered his binoculars and looked toward Captain Michael Donovan, who was already listening to updates over the emergency radio. The wildfire had begun losing momentum along the eastern perimeter after firefighters successfully strengthened the containment line, and the reduced pressure at the propane storage yard had eliminated the greatest threat to the heart of Pine Hollow. Yet one rescue still remained unfinished. Ranger needed no instruction. The German shepherd bounded down the Ranger trail with unwavering confidence, leading Ethan toward a narrow gravel road that curved along the riverbank. Fallen branches littered the path, but enough space remained for them to continue on foot. The closer they came to the bridge, the quieter the world seemed to become. The roar of engines faded behind them, replaced by the gentle rush of water moving beneath weathered wooden beams. Ash floated onto the river's surface and disappeared with the current, as though the town itself was slowly washing away the fear of the morning. Ranger suddenly accelerated, his nose catching a fresh scent carried by the cool air rising from the water. He reached the pickup first and circled the driver's side before stopping beside the rear passenger door. Inside sat an elderly school librarian named Helen Brooks, her silver hair neatly tied back despite the long ordeal. Beside her rested 3 frightened rescue cats secured inside travel carriers. She rolled down the window with a trembling hand and offered an apologetic smile. "I could not leave them behind," she said softly. The shelter asked if someone would bring them to the evacuation center, but a tree blocked the road before I could cross the bridge. Ethan opened the door and helped her from the truck while Ranger calmly approached the carriers, gently sniffing each frightened animal until their nervous cries slowly quieted. Captain Donovan soon arrived with additional responders who quickly cleared the fallen branches using hand tools, allowing the pickup to be guided safely across the bridge. As the small convoy reached the Western Evacuation Center, applause quietly spread among the gathered residents. Families recognized Helen. Children recognized the orange rescue cats that often visited the library reading room. More than one firefighter smiled when Ranger stepped from the truck covered in ash, his tail wagging gently for the first time all day. By late afternoon, the wind finally weakened. Helicopters continued dropping water along the remaining hot spots, while ground crews secured the final sections of fire line. The orange glow that had threatened Pine Hollow at sunrise slowly faded into a soft haze hanging above blackened hillsides now guarded by hundreds of determined firefighters. Investigators later confirmed what Ethan had quietly suspected from the beginning. Ranger's first warning outside the blue farmhouse had never been about the house itself. The German Shepherd had detected the faint propane odor drifting ahead of the approaching wildfire long before any alarm system or weather model revealed how quickly the danger would spread. That single instinct had redirected rescue teams toward the storage yard, uncovered forgotten evacuation routes, saved stranded families, and given firefighters the precious time they needed to protect the entire town. As evening settled across Pine Hollow, the church bell rang once again. This time its gentle sound carried not as a warning, but as a promise that hope had endured. Autumn arrived quietly over Pine Hollow 3 weeks later. The sharp scent of smoke had given way to fresh pine carried by cool morning breezes, while new green shoots pushed through the dark soil where the wildfire had once threatened to erase everything the town loved. Volunteers rebuilt fences together. Children returned to school with stories they would never forget, and neighbors who had barely known one another before the disaster now greeted each day like family. The old church welcomed people again beneath its weathered bell tower. The community shelter remained open for those still repairing their homes, and the library doors swung wide as Helen Brooks smiled beside the same 3 rescue cats that now wandered peacefully between bookshelves as though they had always belonged there. On a bright Saturday morning, the entire town gathered in the park overlooking the river. Firefighters stood shoulder to shoulder with police officers, utility workers, paramedics, volunteers, and families whose lives had crossed in extraordinary ways during those unforgettable hours. Mayor Rebecca Collins stepped to a simple wooden podium decorated with fresh wildflowers collected by local children. There were no grand speeches about heroes or impossible courage. Instead, she spoke about ordinary people choosing to care for one another when fear could have divided them. She thanked every responder by name, every volunteer who carried supplies, every neighbor who opened a home, and every child whose quiet bravery reminded adults why hope was always worth protecting. Then she smiled toward Ethan Walker. Ranger sat beside him wearing a freshly cleaned service harness, his amber eyes calmly watching the crowd while his tail rested gently against the grass. The mayor knelt so that she was face to face with the German Shepherd before fastening a small silver medal to the front of his harness. It was not large or elaborate. It simply bore the image of a pine tree beside the words "Faithful Guardian." Ranger tilted his head for a brief moment before looking back toward Ethan as though the only reward he truly needed was the familiar hand resting softly behind his ears. The crowd rose together in quiet applause that lingered far longer than anyone expected. Ethan never spoke into the microphone. He simply looked across the people gathered beneath the clear Colorado sky and remembered every frightened face that had become another life safely brought home. Captain Michael Donovan stepped beside him with a warm smile. "Sometimes experience saves a town," he said softly. "Sometimes it is one good dog who reminds all of us where to look." Ethan nodded, his eyes settling once more on Ranger. "He never stopped listening," he replied. "The rest of us just had to learn to trust him." As the ceremony ended, children surrounded Ranger with careful hands and joyful laughter. The German Shepherd accepted every gentle pat with patient dignity before walking toward the edge of the park beside Ethan. Together, they overlooked Pine Hollow glowing beneath the golden light of late afternoon, its home standing peacefully beneath blue skies once again. Church bells echoed softly across the valley while the river carried away the final traces of ash from weeks before. Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder, and neither of them needed words to understand what the morning of the fire had quietly revealed. Courage is often measured in moments that last only seconds. Loyalty is measured across an entire lifetime. And sometimes the smallest warning, heard by the right heart at exactly the right time, becomes the quiet miracle that allows an entire town to wake up to another sunrise.